The Enterprise D hummed with its usual steady rhythm as Chief O'Brien monitored the transporter console on Deck 8. It was a routine afternoon, or at least it seemed that way until the sensor network detected an unprecedented spatial anomaly near Earth's surface. A subspace rupture, precisely calibrated, unlike anything in Federation records. Captain Picard had authorized a limited probe, scientific curiosity overriding caution. The probe's data was still being analyzed when the anomaly collapsed inward with violent force. 3 seconds later, the transporter alarm screamed. "Chief, we've got an unauthorized transport." O'Brien's fingers flew across his console. 2 humanoid signatures materializing in Chamber 3. No authorization code. I'm not even sure how they locked onto our pattern buffers. The subspace interference should have made that impossible. Before he could initiate containment protocols, the transport sequence completed. 2 figures solidified in the transporter chamber, both gasping as if they'd been pulled through a dimension that didn't quite fit their bodies. One was a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair, leather jacket, and an expression of lethal pragmatism. A gun was holstered at her hip. The other was a man with pale, aristocratic features, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to contain centuries of careful calculation. His clothing was expensive, European, anachronistic. Status. Picard's voice crackled through the calm as O'Brien locked down the chamber. 2 unknown individuals, Captain. Humanoid, but the bioscanners are giving contradictory readings. I've never seen anything like it. Within minutes, the bridge had assembled. Captain Jean-Luc Picard entered the observation room overlooking the transporter chamber with Data and Worf flanking him. Security had cordoned off the area. The woman stood with her hand near her gun, not drawing, but making it clear that weapons were a language she spoke fluently. The man beside her was perfectly composed, studying the transporter chamber with an expression of serene interest, as if he'd simply stepped into an upscale hotel lobby rather than materialized in an unknown vessel. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise," Picard began, his voice steady and measured. "You are aboard a Federation vessel. We mean you no harm, but I need to know your identities and how you came to be aboard this ship." The woman's hand tightened slightly on her gun. "Where the hell are we?" Her accent was American Midwest, her tone brooking no diplomatic niceties. "1 second we're investigating a site in Missouri, and the next." She gestured sharply at the transporter chamber walls. "This. What kind of tech is this?" The man beside her turned smoothly, his movements fluid and utterly controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried a French accent, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "Captain Picard, is it? I am Jean-Claude. This is Anita Blake. We are, I believe, very far from home." He smiled, and even through the observation window, Data noted the peculiar geometry of his teeth. "And before you ask, we are not precisely what your instruments will tell you we are." Picard's jaw tightened. "Explain." "We were investigating a paranormal phenomenon," Anita said, her eyes never leaving the observation window, as if she could sense they were being watched. "There was a tear in reality. It pulled us through." She looked directly at Jean-Claude. "This isn't Earth anymore, is it?" "No," Jean-Claude confirmed softly. "The air smells wrong. The gravity is artificial, precise. The hum of the machinery, it's not electricity as we know it." He turned back to Picard. "Captain, I suspect we have traveled not just across space, but across realities. The question is whether you are equipped to understand what we are, or whether fear will dictate your response." In the observation room, Worf's hand moved instinctively toward his communicator. "Captain. They are armed and making cryptic statements. Recommend security takeover of the chamber." "Belay that," Picard commanded quietly. "Mr. Data, your assessment." Data's eyes had been fixed on the 2 figures with intense focus. "Captain, the bioscanner readings are inconsistent. The female exhibits elevated muscle density, cardiovascular markers suggesting enhanced physical capability. The male's readings are even more anomalous. Cellular structure shows signs of "I am uncertain." The data appears corrupted or deliberately obscured by some form of energy field I cannot identify. "You're vampires," Picard said flatly, watching for reaction. Anita laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Finally. Someone willing to say it out loud instead of dancing around it with scientific doublespeak. She gestured at the scanner pickup. "Your fancy sensors can't classify what we are because your universe doesn't have the magical framework that created us. Where we come from, the supernatural is real. Vampires, necromancy, psychic powers, they're not science fiction. They're just different science." Jean-Claude placed a restraining hand on her shoulder, a gesture of ownership as much as comfort. "Anita, perhaps we allow Captain Picard to acclimate to this revelation before we flood him with existential complications." He turned back to the window. "Captain, I have lived for over 300 years. I am, by your timeline, impossible. My companion has the ability to command the dead. We do not fully understand how we came to be aboard your vessel, but I suspect your subspace anomaly was not natural. It was a doorway." Picard made a decision. "Release them from the chamber. Post security outside. I want them in separate quarters under guard, comfortable quarters, but monitored. I want full medical scans, but nothing invasive. And I want a meeting in my ready room in 1 hour with Data, Counselor Troy, and Dr. Crusher." "Captain," Worf protested, allowing potential threats to roam freely. "They're not going anywhere, Mr. Worf. The Enterprise is in deep space, far from any territory they recognize. Running would be pointless." Picard's eyes remained fixed on the two figures below. "Besides, I suspect that these two are far more interested in understanding what has happened to them than in causing trouble. At least, not yet." As security escorted them from the chamber, Anita caught Picard's eye directly, and he saw something in her gaze that reminded him of Worf. A warrior's respect, given sparingly and earned through demonstrated competence. Jean-Claude, by contrast, smiled with the satisfaction of a player who had just revealed his hand and found his opponent intrigued rather than terrified. The universe had just become significantly more complicated. But then again, Picard thought, that was what exploration meant. Dr. Beverly Crusher examined Anita Blake with a mixture of scientific fascination and barely concealed unease. The medical bay's sensors hummed steadily, painting contradictory pictures on every display. Blood pressure elevated but stable. Heart rate slow, impossibly slow for human baseline. Cellular regeneration markers off the charts. Neural activity in patterns Crusher had never seen outside of severe neurological damage. "Your heart rate is approximately 40 beats per minute, Crusher said, not looking up from her tricorder. A human at rest should maintain 60 to 80. How are you maintaining consciousness?" "Vampire," Anita replied flatly, sitting on the medical bed with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being studied. "Dead things don't need much oxygen. My heart beats because habit and the marks on my body demand it, but I could survive without it if necessary." "The marks you keep mentioning," Crusher pressed on. "I'm detecting unusual scarring patterns across your body. Some appear to be decades old, others recent. And your psychic energy signature," Crusher paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've never recorded anything like it. It's as if your consciousness is partially distributed across the physical world. It shouldn't be possible." Anita shrugged. "In my universe, magic works. Vampires create bonds with their bloodline. I've got marks from Jean-Claude, marks from other vampires, and marks I've given to people who depend on me. Those connections let us sense each other, sometimes share power. Here, though." She frowned, genuine confusion crossing her face for the first time. "It's like the signals are getting scrambled. I can feel Jean-Claude in the next room, but it's like trying to understand someone speaking through static. Your ship's systems are interfering with the connection. In the adjacent medical bay, Jean-Claude was proving far more cooperative and considerably more evasive. He answered every question with precise accuracy while revealing almost nothing of strategic importance. Yes, he was a vampire. Yes, he had psychic abilities. Yes, he had lived for approximately 320 years, though he was vague about which 3 centuries. No, he did not believe he posed a threat to the Enterprise or its crew, though he understood why Captain Picard might remain suspicious. When Counselor Deanna Troi entered to conduct a psychological evaluation, Jean-Claude greeted her with the courtesy of a man meeting a dignitary at a state function. Troi, accustomed to reading emotional subtext through her empathic abilities, found herself struggling. "Your emotional state is remarkably controlled," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "I have had 3 centuries to learn control, Counselor," he replied smoothly. "Emotion is a tool. Like any tool, it serves best when wielded by a steady hand rather than wielded by emotion itself." "That's a fascinating distinction," Troi said carefully. "But I'm detecting something underneath that control. Concern, perhaps. Uncertainty." Jean-Claude smiled, and Troi noted again, as others had, the peculiar quality of those teeth. "You are perceptive." "Yes, I am concerned. I have spent my entire existence mastering the rules of my world. I have negotiated with vampires, warlocks, were-creatures, and humans. I understand hierarchy, magic, psychic politics. Here, I understand nothing. My powers function differently. My knowledge is useless. That is, disconcerting. Would you hurt the crew to regain your footing?" Troi asked directly. "No," Jean-Claude said, and his certainty carried absolute conviction. "Anita and I survive by understanding people, by forming alliances, by being too valuable to kill. Harming your crew would accomplish the opposite. We would become enemies to the most powerful military force we have encountered. That would be poor strategy." Meanwhile, in Picard's ready room, Data was presenting his analysis to the accuracy while revealing almost nothing of strategic importance. Yes, he was a vampire. Yes, he had psychic abilities. Yes, he had lived for approximately 320 years, though he was vague about which 3 centuries. No, he did not believe he posed a threat to the Enterprise or its crew, though he understood why Captain Picard might remain suspicious. When Counselor Deanna Troi entered to conduct a psychological evaluation, Jean-Claude greeted her with the courtesy of a man meeting a dignitary at a state function. Troi, accustomed to reading emotional subtext through her empathic abilities, found herself struggling. "Your emotional state is remarkably controlled," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "I have had 3 centuries to learn control, Counselor," he replied smoothly. "Emotion is a tool. Like any tool, it serves best when wielded by a steady hand rather than wielded by emotion itself." "That's a fascinating distinction," Troi said carefully. "But I'm detecting something underneath that control. Concern, perhaps. Uncertainty." Jean-Claude smiled, and Troi noted again, as others had, the peculiar quality of those teeth. "You are perceptive." "Yes, I am concerned. I have spent my entire existence mastering the rules of my world. I have negotiated with vampires, warlocks, were-creatures, and humans. I understand hierarchy, magic, psychic politics. Here, I understand nothing. My powers function differently. My knowledge is useless. That is, disconcerting. Would you hurt the crew to regain your footing?" Troi asked directly. "No," Jean-Claude said, and his certainty carried absolute conviction. "Anita and I survive by understanding people, by forming alliances, by being too valuable to kill. Harming your crew would accomplish the opposite. We would become enemies to the most powerful military force we have encountered. That would be poor strategy. Meanwhile, in Picard's ready room, Data was presenting his analysis to the Captain. The android's positronic systems had been working overtime processing the contradiction between the two newcomers' stated nature and scientific precedent. Based on available medical data, began, both individuals exhibit physiological markers consistent with what might be termed undead status. Anita Blake's cellular structure shows profound metabolic differences from human baseline. Her muscles contain a form of energy signature I can only compare to a battery. Dense, compartmentalized, separate from traditional ATP production. Jean-Claude's physiology is even more anomalous. His cells appear to be in a state of permanent stasis, neither living nor dead by Federation definition. Both should be impossible. Yet they exist, Picard observed. The question is whether they're a threat. What do your social algorithms suggest, Data? Anita Blake exhibits what I would classify as controlled hostility masked by pragmatism. She does not trust easily but respects demonstrated competence. She is likely to cooperate if she understands the mutual benefit. Data paused, his head tilting slightly. Jean-Claude is considerably more sophisticated. His stated motivations appear genuine: survival, adaptation, alliance building. Yet I calculate a 93% probability that he is simultaneously planning multiple contingencies for escape, recruitment of allies among our crew, and exploitation of our institutional weaknesses. He is not malicious, precisely. But neither is he trustworthy in the traditional sense. So one is a soldier and one is a politician, Picard summarized. Dangerous in different ways. Affirmative, Captain. The meeting with Anita and Jean-Claude took place in Picard's ready room at 1900 hours. Both had been given clean clothes, Anita in a Starfleet uniform that she wore with obvious discomfort, Jean-Claude in civilian attire that somehow maintained its European elegance despite being replicated by the Enterprise's computer. Picard noted that Jean-Claude had been careful to position himself slightly behind and to the left of Anita, a position of power masked as deference. Let me be clear about the situation, Picard began, settling behind his desk. You have arrived in a universe governed by the principles of scientific rationalism. Magic, as you describe it, does not exist in our framework. Vampires do not exist. Necromancy does not exist. Yet I have censored data that contradicts this fundamental assumption. Your framework is wrong, Anita said bluntly. Magic exists. It just operates on different principles than your physics. Where we come from, reality is more flexible. Your universe seems rigid. Physics-bound. It's like everything here follows strict rules with no exceptions. The laws of physics are not arbitrary, Picard replied. They are the foundation upon which all understanding is built. If you exist in defiance of those laws, then either the laws are wrong, or you are not what you claim. Jean-Claude leaned forward slightly. Captain, might I suggest a third possibility? That your laws of physics and our laws of magic are not contradictory but complementary. We do not defy your universe's rules. We simply operate according to principles you have not yet discovered. Consider antimatter, or dark matter, or the subspace field itself. All exist in your universe, yet all were unknown until someone looked for them. Picard had to concede the point. Assuming that's true, I still need to know your intentions. You came here through no fault of your own, but now you are here. What do you want? To go home, Anita said immediately. Figure out how to navigate back through whatever dimensional rift brought us here and get back to Earth. Alternatively, Jean-Claude added smoothly, if returning proves impossible, to establish ourselves in this new reality in a manner that is mutually beneficial. We have skills, Captain. Anita is perhaps the finest investigator and tracker I have encountered in 3 centuries. I myself have diplomatic experience across numerous factions and cultures. We are not useless here. You're also dangerous, Picard observed. Anita Blake, you describe yourself as a necromancer, someone who animates the dead. That violates fundamental Federation ethics regarding the sanctity of consciousness. Jean-Claude, you state that you can form psychic bonds with individuals. That borders on telepathic manipulation. Both of these capabilities would be considered weapons under Federation law. Then we don't advertise them, Anita said flatly. I'm not looking for a career as a professional gravedigger. Necromancy is a tool I use when necessary. Most of the time, I solve problems the same way your people do: investigation, negotiation, and if all else fails, firepower. I would never violate the consciousness of your crew without explicit consent, Jean-Claude stated, his tone suggesting that this was simply a matter of professional courtesy. The marks I create are bonds of power sharing, yes, but they require mutual agreement. They are no more manipulative than your own technology. Your transporters disassemble consciousness and reassemble it across distances. The ethics depend entirely on consent and context. Picard studied both of them for a long moment. You'll be confined to quarters for now. We'll continue medical evaluation. I want to understand what you are before I make any decisions about your future status aboard this ship. You'll have access to our computers. Perhaps you can help us understand the anomaly that brought you here. But understand this, if you pose a threat to my crew, I will not hesitate to take action. We understand perfectly, Jean-Claude said, rising with the grace of a man accustomed to dismissal. Thank you for your hospitality, Captain. I assure you, we are far more interested in understanding than in conflict. As they left the ready room, Anita caught one final glimpse of Picard's expression. Not fear, not hostility, but sharp, analytical interest. He was a hunter too, she realized. Different prey, different methods, but the same fundamental drive to understand and control his environment. That might make him an ally. It might make him an enemy. Either way, the game had just become considerably more complex. Data spent the next 18 hours in continuous analysis, cross-referencing every anomalous reading against Federation databases, theoretical physics papers, and xenobiological records. The results were simultaneously fascinating and deeply troubling. By the time he requested an emergency senior staff meeting, he had compiled sufficient data to fundamentally challenge the Federation's understanding of what constituted life itself. Observe, Data said, displaying holographic representations of Anita's and Jean-Claude's cellular structures side by side with baseline human physiology. Anita Blake's cells are in a state of permanent stasis, yet they function. Her metabolism operates approximately 40% of baseline human efficiency, yet her physical strength exceeds human maximum by a factor of 3. This should be impossible. The energy required for her muscular output should exceed her metabolic capacity by orders of magnitude. She's drawing power from somewhere else, Geordi LaForge suggested, leaning forward to study the display. Some kind of external energy source. Precisely, Data confirmed. Her cellular structure contains what I can only describe as psychic battery formations. Energy storage at a quantum level, harvested from what she terms the Mark network. Jean-Claude's physiology is even more extraordinary. His cells are not merely in stasis, they are locked in a state of permanent cellular division and apoptosis, simultaneously dying and regenerating at the quantum level. He should not exist. By every law of thermodynamics and cellular biology, his cells should have degraded into entropy billions of years ago. Then how is he alive? Dr. Crusher asked, her medical training warring with the impossibility of what she was hearing. That, Data said slowly, is the primary question. His consciousness appears to exist partially outside his physical form. My best hypothesis is that his consciousness is distributed across a psychic field, what he terms marks in other individuals. His physical body is merely an anchor point for a vastly larger psychic entity. If his physical form were destroyed, his consciousness would likely persist, transferable to another body through the Mark network. The silence that followed was profound. Worf broke it first. A consciousness that can survive physical death is precisely the kind of threat the Prime Directive was designed to protect lesser species against. However, Picard interjected, the Prime Directive applies to our interference with developing civilizations. These too are not representatives of a civilization. They are refugees from another reality entirely. The Prime Directive does not address our responsibility to beings who arrive through no intentional action of their own. With respect, Captain, Worf continued, they represent a form of power we do not understand and cannot properly contain. Anita Blake's necromantic abilities suggest consciousness manipulation on a scale that could destabilize entire populations if weaponized. Jean-Claude's distributed consciousness makes him effectively immortal and potentially uncontrollable. Which is precisely why we need to understand them better, Counselor Troy added. I've been reviewing the psychological evaluations. Both are fundamentally pragmatists. They're not interested in conquest or domination. They're interested in survival and, frankly, understanding what's happened to them. Anita is genuinely disoriented, her psychic connections are scrambled by our subspace fields. Jean-Claude is more controlled, but even he is operating at reduced capacity. Captain Picard made a decision. I want them integrated into the crew on a provisional basis. Anita can work with security and investigation teams, her tracking and analytical skills could be valuable. Jean-Claude can work with our diplomatic corps. Give them access to the ship, but maintain discreet monitoring. If they attempt to exploit their knowledge of our systems or recruit crew members, we take action immediately. And if they're working toward an escape? Worf pressed. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Picard said, his tone brooking no further argument. For now, they're assets to be understood, not threats to be contained. Anita's first assignment came within hours. The Enterprise had received a distress call from a Federation research outpost on Keswick 4, an ice world in the Caleb sector. Initial reports suggested a breach in the outpost's atmospheric containment systems, but the secondary communications from the outpost had become increasingly garbled. Security Chief Worf had requested additional investigative resources, and Picard had assigned Anita to the away team alongside Riker, Data, and a security detail. Standing in the transporter room, Anita felt the familiar crawl of unease that always preceded her entry into unknown territory. The transporter itself was unsettling. The idea of being disassembled and reassembled felt like a violation of fundamental law, a form of death and resurrection that should not be survivable. Yet Jean-Claude had explained that vampires could survive the process, though the experience was disorienting. All set? Riker asked, his easy confidence doing little to settle her nerves. No, Anita replied bluntly. But let's do it anyway. The transporter's shimmer dissolved around her, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, Anita existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously herself and not herself, distributed across subspace and reality. Then the ice world resolved around her, crystalline and hostile, and she gasped air so cold it burned her lungs. Keswick 4 was a nightmare of geological violence. The outpost sat in a valley surrounded by towering ice cliffs, but something had changed since the initial distress call. The atmospheric processors that should have been visible on the ridge were dark. Worse, there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, of decay and something else. Something that made every predatory instinct Anita possessed go rigid with warning. Atmospheric readings are within acceptable parameters, Data reported, his tricorder clicking softly. However, I am detecting unusual trace compounds. There appears to be a biological agent present in the air, viral in nature, though the structure is unfamiliar. The outpost, Riker said grimly, gesturing toward the reinforced structure ahead. The exterior airlock was open, emergency lights pulsing weakly. Something forced their containment to fail. As they approached, Anita felt it again, that sense of predatory wrongness. We're not alone, she said quietly. Something's watching us. Data's tricorder chirped. I am detecting 3 humanoid life signs within the outpost, all exhibiting elevated body temperature and unusual neural patterns. They are approximately 40 meters ahead, in the main laboratory section. They found the first body in the corridor leading to the lab, Dr. Sarah Chen, according to her nameplate, hanging suspended from the ceiling by what appeared to be some kind of crystalline growth. The ice that coated her was not frozen, it was warm to the touch, pulsing with bioluminescent light. Her body was still moving, still breathing, but her eyes were vacant and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Dear God," Riker whispered. "Not God," Anita said, her hand dropping instinctively to her gun. "Something else. Something that shouldn't exist even in a universe where magic is real." She'd hunted vampires, werewolves, necromancers, and creatures that defied classification. But this was something new. We need to find the source. Where there's one hive organism, there's usually a queen. Data and Riker exchanged glances. "Hive organism?" Riker asked. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've hunted things in my universe that operate the same way," Anita replied. "This isn't Borg assimilation, it's biological. Parasitism. Something is consuming their consciousness while keeping them alive. That requires coordination. It requires a central intelligence. In the laboratory, they found it. A massive crystalline structure that had grown from the floor and walls, pulsing with that same bioluminescent glow. And suspended within it, her consciousness still partially intact, was Dr. James Morrison, the outpost commander. His eyes tracked their movement with terrible awareness, recognizing them but unable to control his own body. It came through the research samples. Morrison managed to croak out, his voice distorted by the crystalline growth encasing his throat. "We were studying a new mineral formation. Something in the core, it wasn't mineral. It was alive. It spread through the air recycling system. It wants to expand. It wants to grow. How do we kill it?" Anita demanded. "You don't," Morrison gasped. "It's already in the atmosphere. It's already in your ship. When you transported here, you brought some of it with you. It's already spreading." Data's expression didn't change, but Riker's face went pale. "We need to warn the Enterprise immediately. Get to the transporter coordinates." The crystalline growth erupted from the walls around them, tendrils of luminescent ice lashing out with predatory speed. Anita fired twice, her shots passing cleanly through the crystalline structure without slowing its advance. But the shots had revealed something crucial. The organism had a neural cluster, a central mass that the tendrils were protecting. "There," she shouted, adjusting her aim toward the pulsing core. "That's the queen. Take it out and you disrupt the whole network." Data moved with inhuman precision, firing his phaser with calculated intensity directly at the neural cluster. The organism shrieked, an impossibly high-pitched sound that seemed to exist partially outside normal audio range, and began to contract. "Transporter, now." Riker was already activating his communicator. "Enterprise, emergency beam up, all personnel." But as the transporter shimmer embraced them, Anita saw something that made her blood run cold. The crystalline growth was adapting, changing its structure, becoming denser and more resilient. It had learned from the phaser fire. It would be far more difficult to kill if they encountered it again. The Enterprise materialized around them, and alarms were already screaming. The moment the away team rematerialized, Picard's voice cut through the red alert klaxons. "Quarantine those personnel in Medical Bay 2. No exceptions. Mr. LaForge, I want a full environmental scan of the transporter buffer. If that organism made it aboard this ship, I need to know immediately." Anita found herself in a containment field, the transparent aluminum barrier between her and freedom far more effective than any physical restraint. Jean-Claude was visible through the adjacent barrier, watching the proceedings with the serene patience of someone who had endured far worse than temporary imprisonment. Dr. Crusher moved through the medical bay with controlled urgency, scanning each team member for contamination. The organism is not present in your bloodstream, she announced after examining Data and Riker. But Commander Riker, you were in direct contact with the crystalline growth. I'm detecting trace amounts of the viral compound in your respiratory system. How long before it becomes dangerous? Riker asked, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. Unknown, Crusher admitted. We don't have any baseline for how fast this organism propagates. If it follows standard viral progression, you have hours, possibly days. If it's as adaptive as the samples suggest, it could be much faster. In the transporter room, Geordi had made a discovery that sent a shiver through the entire senior staff. Captain, we found something in the buffer matrix, he reported over the comm, crystalline particles, dormant but viable. They're already beginning to restructure. Whatever this thing is, it's tough. Even the transporter's molecular reassembly didn't destroy it completely. Can you purge the buffer? Picard demanded. Already working on it, sir. But if even a fragment made it into the ship's systems. Geordi didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Picard's decision came swiftly. All transporter operations are suspended indefinitely. I want continuous environmental scans in every section of the ship. If we detect any crystalline growth anywhere aboard, I want immediate notification. He paused, then added grimly, and contact Starfleet Command. We may need to implement quarantine protocols on a fleet-wide basis. In Medical Bay 2, Anita watched the organized chaos with the analytical eye of a hunter assessing a kill zone. The crew moved with impressive coordination, but she could see the fear beneath their professionalism. This was a threat they didn't understand, couldn't classify, couldn't predict. That made them desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. It's already here, she said quietly, to no one in particular. In your systems. Growing right now while we sit behind this barrier. Jean-Claude's voice came from the adjacent containment field, perfectly calm. An astute observation, but not yet actionable. We must wait and see how your Federation responds to a threat they cannot immediately quantify. Your crew is competent, Anita acknowledged, grudgingly. But they're thinking like scientists. That organism isn't a scientific problem. It's a predator. It thinks like a hunter. It adapts like prey learning to avoid traps. You can't reason with it or contain it through logic alone. Picard entered the medical bay 20 minutes later, his expression grave. I've been briefed on your assessment, Ms. Blake. You seem to have identified something in that organism that our sensors missed. How? Experience, Anita replied. I've spent my entire life hunting things that exist outside normal reality. Your universe has rules, hard rules, physics, biology, cause and effect. But that thing on Keswick 4 operates differently. It's not bound by the same constraints. It's a predator, pure and simple, and it's showing problem-solving behavior. That means it's intelligent. Not human intelligent, but intelligent. Enough to be dangerous. And in your professional opinion, Picard pressed, how do we kill it? You don't kill it, Anita said flatly. You contain it. Isolate it. Keep it from spreading. Killing it just makes it angrier and more adaptive. I've learned that lesson the hard way. Jean-Claude had been silent, but now he spoke, his voice carrying weight that made even Picard pause. Captain, might I suggest a different approach? The organism spreads through biological vectors. Air, physical contact, perhaps through your computer systems if it can interface with biological electronic interfaces. But it is driven by hunger and growth. What if you were to starve it? Explain, Picard commanded. The outpost had a functioning ecosystem, however artificial, Jean-Claude continued. The organism had hosts, had an environment conducive to expansion. What if you were to create an environment where it cannot propagate? Vacuum, perhaps, or conditions that prevent biological function. Data, standing at the monitoring station, caught the implication immediately. The captain is suggesting environmental restructuring in affected sections. Seal the compromised areas, reduce atmospheric pressure, lower temperature to inhibit viral replication. It would not kill the organism but would force it into metabolic dormancy. Exactly, Jean-Claude said, inclining his head slightly. And once dormant, it becomes manageable. Study it, contain it, perhaps even reverse engineer its biology, all from a position of safety rather than crisis. Picard was quiet for a long moment, processing the suggestion. Finally, he nodded. Sound reasoning. Mr. LaForge, I want teams preparing environmental modification protocols for any sections that show contamination. We're not waiting for this thing to spread further. As Picard turned to leave, Anita called out, Captain. You need to understand something about that organism. It's not just hungry. It's learning. Every time we engaged it on Keswick 4, it changed. It adapted. If you don't move fast, it will develop defenses against whatever containment strategy you implement. Picard paused at the door. Then we'll have to be faster than it is. And Ms. Blake, thank you for the assessment. Your perspective is proving valuable. The next 6 hours became a masterclass in rapid response. Picard implemented a three-pronged strategy. First, immediate environmental isolation of any section where crystalline growth was detected. Second, continuous monitoring of all biological personnel for signs of contamination. Third, accelerated research into the organism's biology and weakness identification. And crucially, he released Anita and Jean-Claude from medical containment. They may attempt to escape, Worf protested when Picard announced the decision at the next senior staff meeting. Releasing them now, with the ship in crisis, is a calculated risk, Picard finished. But they have already provided insights that our own analysis would have taken hours to reach. And frankly, Mr. Worf, we need all available resources to address this threat. Both of them have demonstrated expertise in biological anomalies. That expertise may be critical. Anita was assigned to work directly with Data and Dr. Crusher, analyzing the crystalline samples in the secure laboratory. Jean-Claude found himself in an unexpected role as strategic consultant to Picard himself, helping to think through containment scenarios and potential weaknesses. It was in the laboratory that Anita made the critical discovery. While examining the dormant crystalline fragments under magnification, she noticed something that the Federation's automated analysis had missed. The organism's crystalline structure contained what appeared to be information encoded at the molecular level. It's not just growing, she explained to Data and Crusher. It's building. Like it's constructing something. Look at the pattern here, this repeats, this section branches into multiple configurations. This is deliberate architecture. Data's positronic processors engaged at maximum capacity. You are suggesting the organism is constructing a communication network. Or perhaps a sensory apparatus. I'm suggesting it's smarter than we gave it credit for, Anita said. Every fragment has some of that pattern. What if every infected organism is still connected to every other infected organism through this network? What if it's not a hive with one queen? It's a distributed consciousness spread across all its hosts. The implications hit Crusher immediately. Then Commander Riker is still connected to it, Anita finished grimly. Even if we isolate all the crystalline growth, if he's already contaminated, if that virus is replicating in his system, he's a living extension of the organism. A vector. Picard made the hardest decision of his command. Riker was confined to a sealed isolation chamber, medical monitoring continuous but contact severely limited. The commander accepted the decision with the stoicism of a starship officer, understanding that his potential contamination made him a liability to the entire crew. But it was Jean-Claude who identified the real problem during a late-night strategy session in Picard's ready room. Your isolation protocols assume the organism spreads through traditional biological vectors, Jean-Claude said, settling into a chair with his usual aristocratic composure. But consider, this organism demonstrated the ability to interface with your transporter technology on Keswick 4. Your systems are interconnected, your computers, your life support, your communications. If the organism has already achieved even minimal integration with your computer systems, your isolation may be creating pockets of growth rather than containing it. Picard felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. You're suggesting the contamination is already distributed throughout the ship. In our computers? I am suggesting it is a possibility that must be examined, Jean-Claude replied carefully. And if true, environmental isolation becomes counterproductive. You would be sealing sections with an organism that is actively learning to subvert your controls. Then we need to know, Picard decided, activating his communicator. Mr. LaForge, I need you and Data to run a comprehensive diagnostic on all computer systems. I want to know if there is any anomalous code, any unusual system behavior, anything that could indicate contamination. Within the hour, Geordi's grim report came through. There was something subtle, deeply embedded in the secondary systems, replicating slowly but steadily. It wasn't causing obvious problems yet, but it was there, growing, adapting, learning the architecture of the Enterprise DS computer network. The organism didn't just spread through biology. It spread through technology. And on a starship, that made it far more dangerous than any physical threat. The computer core thrummed with its usual electrical hum, but now that sound carried sinister undertones. Geordi and Data worked frantically to isolate the contaminated code sections while Anita stood nearby, watching with the intense focus of a hunter tracking wounded prey. The organism is using your binary logic as a framework, Anita observed, studying the holographic representation of the infected code. It's not thinking in ones and zeros, it's thinking in terms of growth and adaptation. Every subroutine it infects teaches it more about how your systems work. Data's positronic processors had been running continuous analysis for 8 hours straight. The contamination is approximately 17% integrated with non-critical systems, he reported. Propulsion controls remain uncompromised. Life support is secure. But communication systems, environmental controls, and transporter functions are showing progressive infiltration. Can you isolate it? Picard asked, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. I am attempting a containment protocol, Data replied. However, the organism demonstrates learning behavior incompatible with standard isolation algorithms. Each time I implement a firewall, it develops a counter-strategy within minutes. The process is accelerating. Jean-Claude had positioned himself against the far wall, observing rather than participating, yet Picard found himself deferring to the vampire's analytical insights more frequently than he cared to admit. The older being understood predatory behavior at a level that 300 years of human military science had not yet fully developed. Captain, Jean-Claude said quietly, you are attempting to contain an enemy that operates at the speed of light through your computer systems. You cannot match its reaction time. Containment through isolation will fail. You must instead think like a predator dealing with a more dangerous predator, accept the infiltration and focus on control rather than elimination. You're suggesting we let it spread? Worf's disbelief was palpable. I am suggesting you negotiate the boundaries of its expansion, Jean-Claude clarified. In my world, when two powerful entities recognize mutual threat, they establish territories, rules of engagement, acceptable losses. Perhaps your computer systems could benefit from similar arrangements. Geordi looked skeptical. You want us to negotiate with a virus? I want you to work within its behavioral patterns rather than against them, Jean-Claude replied. The organism seeks to expand, to grow, to consume. What if you were to provide designated expansion zones, areas of your computer that you deliberately allow it to infiltrate while protecting the critical systems through physical isolation rather than code-based firewalls? Data processed this suggestion in the span of a nanosecond. An intriguing approach. By creating preferred expansion zones, we would satisfy the organism's fundamental drive to grow while physically separating those zones from critical command functions. It would require the installation of isolated quantum processors, standalone systems with no connection to the main computer network. Exactly, Jean-Claude said. Compartmentalization through physical architecture rather than digital containment. The strategy had merit, but implementation proved challenging. Getting the necessary components installed would require human technicians to work in close proximity to known contaminated areas. The risk of biological infection to the crew was substantial. It was Anita who volunteered first. "I've spent my entire life working around things that wanted to kill me," she said flatly. "Your organism is dangerous, but it's not more dangerous than what I've hunted before. I can help install the isolator units." "Negative," Worf stated immediately. "You are a security risk. And I'm also someone who understands predatory behavior from a perspective your crew doesn't have," Anita countered. "You need me down there. Not because I'm trustworthy, clearly I'm not, according to Security Chief Worf. But because I'm useful. And right now, useful is what matters." Picard studied her for a long moment, seeing the calculation in her eyes. She was offering herself as valuable precisely because her origins made her suspect. It was a move of calculated risk, a gambit to establish her as indispensable. He recognized the strategy because he'd used similar approaches himself throughout his career. "Ms. Blake, you'll work alongside Geordi and a security detail. You follow their orders precisely. Any deviation and you're confined to quarters while the contamination spreads." "Understood." "Understood," Anita agreed. The isolator installation began in Jeffrey's tube section 7, one of the contaminated areas. Anita moved through the cramped space with surprising grace, her vampire physiology giving her strength and coordination that human technicians couldn't match. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of the organism's presence. It was subtle, a faint warmth in the air, a sense of watching that went beyond simple surveillance. The crystalline growths in this section of the ship were denser than elsewhere, more organized. They formed patterns that suggested intent, almost like nerve ganglia in biological tissue. "There," she said quietly to Geordi, pointing to a particularly dense cluster of growth. "That's a primary nexus. If you can sever the connection between that cluster and the main network before the isolator activates, you can cut off a significant portion of the contamination." Geordi examined the growth with his visor, seeing wavelengths of light that human eyes couldn't process. "You're right. There's a kind of information flow through that structure. If we interrupt it." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Severing that connection would cause the organism pain, would damage it, would force it to adapt once again. "Do it," Anita said. "Every time it adapts, it gets stronger. But every adaptation also makes it more predictable. It's starting to rely on patterns, on strategies that worked before. Eventually, those patterns will become enough of a liability that it makes a mistake." As Geordi moved to sever the connection, the organism reacted. The crystalline growths suddenly expanded, reaching toward them with predatory speed. Anita's gun was in her hand in the instant before conscious thought could catch up to instinct, and she fired twice, not at the organism itself, but at the structural supports connecting the main growth cluster to its secondary nodes. The shots were perfectly calculated. The primary nexus, suddenly disconnected from its network, began to crystallize and fragment. The organism shrieked, that same impossible high-pitched sound that existed partially outside normal audio ranges, and contracted inward. "Go, go, go," Anita urged, moving forward to install the isolator unit while the organism was reacting to the severed connection. It took 17 minutes to complete the installation and activate the isolator field. The quantum processor hummed to life, creating a barrier that the organism could sense but could not cross. The crystalline growths on the far side of the field continued to grow, continued to exist, but were now isolated from the main contamination network. As they exited Jeffrey's Tube 7, Geordi was shaking. That was. I've never seen anything adapt that fast. The moment we severed the connection, it changed its growth pattern. It was like it was planning a counter-strategy in real time. It is, Anita confirmed grimly. And every counter-strategy makes it more dangerous. You're right, your scientists need to understand that you're not dealing with a simple virus. This is a thinking predator that operates at biological and digital levels simultaneously. By the time 8 isolator units had been installed across critical sections of the ship, a pattern had emerged. The organism adapted to each new containment strategy faster than the last. The time between isolation and adaptation had decreased from hours to minutes. At this rate, even the physical isolators would eventually prove insufficient. It was Commander Riker, still confined to his isolation chamber but monitoring the situation through secure communications, who proposed the radical solution. You need to think about this differently, his voice came through the medical bay speaker. That organism is learning from us because we keep trying to kill it, keep trying to contain it. What if instead we gave it something else to think about? Explain, Picard commanded. Introduce a competing predator, Riker suggested. Something that makes the organism perceive an external threat more immediate than expanding through our systems. Force it to focus its adaptive resources on survival rather than growth. Data, monitoring the conversation, engaged immediately. Commander, you are suggesting we deliberately introduce a second biological threat to counteract the first. Not a threat that can replicate and spread like the crystalline organism, Riker clarified. Something contained, controlled, but significant enough to divert the organism's attention. A decoy, essentially. Force it to allocate resources to defending against the decoy rather than continuing its expansion. Anita and Jean-Claude exchanged glances. In the vampire world, they'd both used similar tactics, introducing a threat that compelled a predator to react defensively rather than offensively. It was elegant precisely because it worked with the organism's nature rather than against it. The organism has shown responsiveness to phaser energy, Data noted. We could trigger periodic phaser discharges in the isolated sections, creating the impression of external threat without causing actual destruction. The organism would perceive a predator, your ship's own defensive systems, and adjust its behavior accordingly. It would buy time, Jean-Claude said, his voice thoughtful. Time for your scientists to understand its biology more fully. Time to develop actual countermeasures rather than reactive containment protocols. Picard made the decision swiftly. Implement the strategy. Controlled phaser discharges in the isolated sections, rotating patterns to prevent predictability. And increase research efforts on the organism's biological structure. There has to be a weakness we're missing. As the command team dispersed to implement the new strategy, Anita found herself alone briefly with Jean-Claude in the corridor outside the observation lounge. You're enjoying this, she said quietly, not accusatory, simply observational. Moderately, Jean-Claude admitted. It has been decades since I encountered a problem that could not be solved through political manipulation or threat assessment. This organism thinks in ways that your Federation science cannot comprehend because it thinks like a hunter, like us. That is refreshing. It's also terrifying, Anita countered. If we can't contain it, if it learns fast enough, it could compromise the entire ship. Yes, Jean-Claude agreed simply. But that is what makes the problem interesting, is it not? We are, after all, hunters ourselves. The opportunity to test ourselves against a predator of genuine capability, that is rare. That is precious. Anita wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they were still stranded in an alien universe, still forced to cooperate with a crew that didn't trust them, still fighting for survival. But she recognized the truth in Jean-Claude's words. For the first time since the subspace rift had pulled them through, they were operating at full capacity, using skills they'd spent lifetimes developing. In a universe that made no sense to them, at least the hunt made perfect sense. The phaser strategy worked, but not in the way Picard had anticipated. The organism didn't retreat or adopt a defensive posture. Instead, it began to evolve defenses against phaser energy itself. Each discharge caused localized damage that the organism subsequently learned to prevent. By the third day of controlled discharges, the crystalline growths had developed a reflective surface structure that dispersed phaser energy across broader areas, reducing the weapon's effectiveness by approximately 40%. It's not just adapting, Data reported grimly during the morning briefing. It is learning and retaining information with remarkable efficiency. The organism appears to possess a form of distributed memory. Each infected node carries information about threats encountered. When phaser energy damages a section, the surviving fragments communicate that threat profile to other sections of the organism. The entire network becomes incrementally more resistant. Then the phaser strategy is accelerating its development rather than delaying it, Counselor Troy observed. We're teaching it. Affirmative, data confirmed. However, this same learning capability has revealed something significant. The organism's adaptation follows mathematical progressions. Each iteration improves efficiency by an average of 4.7%. However, this improvement has an asymptotic ceiling. The organism cannot exceed approximately 83% efficiency against phaser dispersal due to the fundamental physics of its crystalline structure. Beyond that point, further adaptation becomes counterproductive. So we're approaching its maximum defensive capability, Picard summarized. At which point, conventional weapons become viable again. Not weapons, Jean-Claude interrupted. The vampire had been monitoring the briefing from the observation gallery, and Picard had come to value his interruptions. You are thinking like a military commander attempting to destroy an enemy. But this organism is not an enemy, it is a competitor for resources. And competitors can be managed through supply restriction rather than direct confrontation. Anita leaned forward. He's right. You've been approaching this like a war. But this is more like a predator-prey relationship. You don't kill the wolf by fighting it directly. You manage the wolf by controlling its food source. The organism requires biological material to propagate, Picard said slowly, working through the logic. It feeds on the consciousness of infected hosts. What if we were to eliminate that food source? The infected crew members would die, Worf stated flatly. I cannot recommend that course of action. Unless we could transfer their consciousness to new bodies, Dr. Crusher interjected. The organism requires the consciousness to remain alive to function. It feeds on cognitive activity, from what we've determined. But if we could extract the consciousness and preserve it in a digital format while we sterilize the biological host. Essentially, you would be uploading their minds into your computer network, Jean-Claude observed. A temporary solution at best, and it creates new ethical complications. However, the underlying principle has merit. Starve the organism by eliminating its prey. The solution they eventually developed was a hybrid approach. For the 3 crew members who had been infected by the crystalline organism, including Commander Riker, Dr. Crusher implemented a carefully designed procedure. She used the ship's holographic systems to create temporary consciousness containers while advanced phage therapy targeted the crystalline growths in the host's biological systems. The phage itself was a small miracle of biotechnology. Microscopic viral constructs engineered specifically to destroy the organism's crystalline structure without harming human cells. It was agonizing to watch. Riker's consciousness, briefly extracted into holographic format, existed in a state that was neither fully alive nor fully digital. The experience left him profoundly disoriented, describing moments of existence where he couldn't determine if he was real or simulation, alive or dead. It felt, Riker explained once he'd been restored to his biological body, cleansed of the organism, like being dismantled and reassembled by someone who'd never quite read the manual. I don't know if I experienced subjective time passing, or if it was instantaneous from my perspective. It's... He trailed off, lacking adequate vocabulary for the experience. But the procedure worked. The phage therapy eliminated the organism's presence in infected tissue. The consciousness transfers, though psychologically traumatic, prevented the organism from accessing the cognitive resources it had been feeding on. Within 48 hours of the procedure, the isolated crystalline growths showed signs of metabolic slowdown. The organism was starving. It was during this period of relative success that the Romulan sensor contacts appeared. 3 starships, cloaked but detectable through the distortions their presence created in subspace, had been tracking the Enterprise DS status. The moment they picked up the subspace transmissions about the unknown organism, Romulan interest became active predatory attention. Picard received the encoded message through subspace static. Federation vessel Enterprise, this is Commander Severin of the Romulan warbird Vexstar. We are aware of your encounter with the biological anomaly from Keswick 4. The Romulan Star Empire offers cooperation in studying this phenomenon. We propose a joint research agreement. Translation: They want samples of the organism, Worf stated flatly. And if we refuse, they will attempt to acquire them by force. Not necessarily, Jean-Claude said thoughtfully. Commander Severin is using diplomatic language. The Tal Shiar would simply attack and retrieve what they wanted. This suggests either genuine scientific interest or uncertainty about Federation defensive capability with the contamination situation. Can we trust a Romulan offer of cooperation? Riker asked, his voice still hoarse from his consciousness extraction. No, Picard replied. But we can use it. If the Romulans believe we have a valuable biological resource, they'll keep their distance rather than risk damaging it through direct assault. Mr. Worf, maintain yellow alert. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, but do not raise shields unless directly threatened. Anita had been unusually quiet during the briefing, but now she spoke. You're assuming the Romulans want to capture the organism. What if they want to study how it works so they can weaponize it? Because if I were a military strategist and I learned about a predatory consciousness that could spread through biological and digital systems, the first thing I'd want is to turn it into a weapon. The silence that followed was profound. She's correct, Data said quietly. The organism demonstrates properties that would make it extraordinarily effective as a biological digital weapon. Deployment on enemy starships would be catastrophic. Propagation would be rapid. Defense would be difficult. Then we cannot allow Romulan acquisition of any samples whatsoever, Picard decided. And we need to accelerate our timeline for complete containment and sterilization. Mr. Worf, redirect all available research personnel to finalizing the phage therapy. I want the isolated contamination completely neutralized within 24 hours. The projections suggest 48 hours minimum, Geordi protested. We need time to ensure the phage therapy doesn't develop resistance patterns like the organism did. Then work faster, Picard commanded. The Romulans will not remain at a distance indefinitely. It was Jean-Claude who made the critical observation during the accelerated research phase. He found Anita in the secure laboratory, studying the organism's crystalline structure with intense focus. You understand this creature, he said quietly, more observation than question. I'm starting to, Anita admitted. It's not that different from the predators I hunt. It has a learning curve, a pattern of adaptation. But it's also limited by its own nature. It can't stop being what it is, a parasite, a predator, a thing that needs to consume consciousness to survive. As are we, Jean-Claude said softly. We are predators too, you and I. We feed on blood, on life force, on the energy of living things. We adapt, we hunt, we survive by being superior to our prey. What separates us from this organism? Conscience, Anita said immediately. Choice. I can choose not to hunt. I can choose not to kill when I don't have to. This thing can't make that choice. It just consumes. Can it? Jean-Claude moved closer, studying the crystalline growth with aristocratic detachment. Or has it simply never been given the option? What if this organism, presented with sufficient environmental pressure and alternative resources, might also choose restraint? You're suggesting we try to negotiate with a virus, Anita said incredulously. I am suggesting that consciousness, in whatever form, responds to incentives, Jean-Claude replied. The organism has been starving because we removed its food source. What if instead we provided it with an alternative? Something that satisfied its fundamental drives without requiring the consumption of Federation crew consciousness. Data, monitoring the conversation from the adjacent laboratory, engaged immediately. An intriguing hypothesis, but implementation would be extraordinarily difficult. The organism requires certain biochemical markers present in human consciousness. Creating a synthetic substitute would require understanding the organism's fundamental needs at a biological level, Jean-Claude finished. Understanding what it is that actually satisfies its hunger. Is it consciousness itself, or something more specific? Cognitive function. Neural electricity. Memories. The investigation took them into deeply uncomfortable territory. Through careful analysis of the infected crew members and the organism's growth patterns, they began to develop a theory. The organism didn't feed on consciousness itself, but on the electrical and chemical potential of neural tissue. Consciousness was merely the vehicle for accessing that energy. It was Dr. Crusher who realized the implications. If that's accurate, then we could theoretically provide a synthetic neural substrate, artificial neural tissue with the same electrical properties as human consciousness but without any actual thoughts, memories, or sensation. You're describing creating a food source that isn't alive, Riker said slowly. That would eliminate the ethical problem of feeding it conscious beings. Theoretically, Crusher said. But creating artificial neural tissue complex enough to satisfy the organism's needs would require technological far beyond current Federation capability. Unless, Data said, his positronic processors engaging at maximum capacity, we utilized my positronic matrix as a template. My neural network produces electrical and chemical patterns functionally identical to human consciousness, yet my specific consciousness remains protected within my positronic brain. We could theoretically create a standalone neural network based on my architecture, consciousness without being conscious. You're volunteering to let them use your biology as a blueprint to feed a predatory organism, Worf said flatly. I am volunteering to provide what information I can toward a solution that preserves both Federation life and potentially allows the organism to survive in non-lethal conditions, Data corrected. It is a logical trade-off. It's insane, Anita said, but there was a note of respect in her voice. It's the kind of thing only a being who doesn't actually fear death would attempt. And it might actually work. Jean-Claude smiled slightly. You see, your Federation's logic-driven android understands something that your warriors do not, that true survival sometimes requires compromise with the enemy. It is a lesson I have learned through 300 years of existence. Picard authorized the research immediately. Within 18 hours, Data and Crusher had engineered the first synthetic neural substrate. A biological matrix grown from Data's positronic architecture but containing no actual consciousness, no memories, no awareness. Just the electrical and chemical signatures of neural activity. They introduced it into one of the isolated contamination chambers. The organism responded with what could only be described as eagerness. The crystalline growths reached for the synthetic tissue with almost enthusiastic intensity, and began to feed. The energy signatures indicated satisfaction. The organism's metabolic activity increased, stabilized, and then plateaued at a sustainable level. It had found food that didn't require the destruction of sentient life. The success of the synthetic neural substrate changed everything. Within 36 hours, Dr. Crusher had cultivated 3 additional matrices, each one introducing the isolated organism to a new food source that satisfied its fundamental biological needs without requiring conscious hosts. The crystalline growths shifted from aggressive expansion to stable maintenance, their growth patterns becoming predictable and manageable. But victory brought unexpected complications. The organism is not dying, data reported during the emergency briefing. Contrary to initial projections, providing it with synthetic neural substrate has not caused metabolic collapse. Instead, it has stabilized. The crystalline growths continue to exist in a state of sustainable proliferation. We have not eliminated the threat, we have merely made it manageable. Which means it remains aboard this ship indefinitely, Picard said, his tone reflecting the weight of that realization. A predatory organism living in our computer systems and bulkheads, dependent on us for survival. A symbiotic relationship rather than a parasitic one, Jean-Claude observed from his position at the observation window. You have made the organism useful, and in doing so, made yourself indispensable to its survival. That is far more effective than destruction. It was at that moment that the Romulan ships dropped their cloaks. 3 warbuds materialized at the edge of sensor range, their weapons charged but not yet firing. Commander Severin's image appeared on the main view screen, her expression calculating and cold. "Federation vessel, your research has progressed remarkably," she stated without preamble. "We have detected your successful cultivation of synthetic neural substrates. The Romulan Star Empire requires access to both the organism and your research data. You have 1 hour to comply, or we will be forced to retrieve it by alternative means." "Meaning they'll blow us to pieces and salvage what remains," Geordi muttered. Picard's response was diplomatic but firm. "Commander Severin, the organism and our research represent Federation scientific property. We cannot simply transfer biological weapons technology to a foreign power, regardless of the threat." "Then you have made your choice," Severin replied, and her warbuds moved to attack formation. "Red alert," Picard commanded. "Raise shields. All hands to battle stations." The Enterprise DS weapons came online as the Romulan vessels accelerated toward attack range. But before the first disruptor volley could be fired, something unexpected happened. The organism, the supposedly contained, starving, manageable organism, suddenly surged with activity. Throughout the ship, the crystalline growths blazed with bioluminescent intensity, and every screen suddenly erupted with visual noise. "We're under attack," Worf shouted. "No, we're being jammed. All communications are being disrupted by some kind of signal originating from within our own systems." Data's positronic processors engaged in rapid analysis. The organism is deliberately amplifying its crystalline resonance across all subspace frequencies. It is creating a jamming field of extraordinary intensity. However, Captain, this does not make logical sense. The organism should not benefit from disrupting our communications. This action does not serve its survival. But Anita understood immediately. She'd spent years studying predatory behavior, understanding how different species thought, how they perceived threat and opportunity. She moved to the communications console and began typing commands. "The organism isn't jamming us randomly," she said urgently. "It's targeting Romulan sensor frequencies specifically. Look at the pattern, it's sophisticated, precise. It's not just interference, it's adaptive interference." Jean-Claude caught onto her reasoning a moment later. "The organism recognizes the Romulan vessels as a threat to its survival," he said slowly. "We have become its symbiotic partners. Therefore, threats to us are threats to it." "You're saying the organism is defending us?" Riker asked incredulously. "I'm saying it's defending its food source," Anita corrected. "Which happens to be us. The organism doesn't understand Federation Romulan politics. It just understands that if the Romulans succeed, its access to synthetic neural substrate ends. So it's fighting back." The Romulan ships, suddenly blinded by the organism's adaptive jamming, were forced to rely on older sensor arrays that barely functioned through the interference. Their targeting accuracy dropped to barely 30%. When they fired, the disruptor bolts struck the Enterprise DS shields ineffectually, the impacts diffused by the random jamming that made accurate targeting impossible. "This is incredible," Data breathed. The organism is learning Romulan sensor technology in real time and developing countermeasures. The sophistication of its adaptive response suggests that it's a lot smarter than we gave it credit for, Anita finished. And it's fighting for its life. Picard made an instantaneous command decision. Maintain shields. Do not return fire. Keep the Romulans at distance but do not escalate. And Mr. Data, attempt to establish communication with the organism. Find out what it wants. "Captain, that is highly irregular," Worf protested. "So is being defended by a predatory consciousness that lives in our walls," Picard countered. "Do it." Data's approach was methodical. Working through the isolated contamination chambers, he established a controlled interface with the organism's consciousness through the synthetic neural substrates it was feeding on. The communication was not language as humans understood it. It was a complex exchange of electrical impulses, chemical signals, and what Data later described as pure conceptual information exchange. The organism perceives us as symbiotic partners, Data reported after the interface concluded. It has made a cost-benefit analysis. The Romulan threat represents existential danger to its food source. By defending us, it ensures its own survival. However, there is another factor. The organism appears to possess something analogous to curiosity. It finds our species intellectually stimulating. It does not wish to see us destroyed because our consciousness, even though it no longer feeds on it, provides stimulation to its sensory apparatus. "It's bored," Geordi said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The organism is bored and we're more interesting than just food." Essentially accurate, Data confirmed. The organism is not mindless. It is a form of distributed consciousness with genuine intellectual properties. In effect, Captain, we have not captured a predator. We have established a partnership with an alien intelligence. The negotiations with the Romulan vessels took on a completely different character once that realization had fully sunk in. Picard, using Data as intermediary, conveyed to Commander Severin that the Federation had successfully integrated an alien consciousness into their systems. The organism, he carefully explained, would defend Federation interests aggressively. It was a bluff, barely. But it was a bluff backed by the organism's demonstrated willingness to actively interfere with hostile sensors. Severin, recognizing that the situation had shifted dramatically in the Federation's favor, made a tactical retreat. "We will withdraw for now," she stated coldly. "But the Romulan Star Empire does not forget. When you tire of your partnership, we will be waiting." As the warbuds powered down weapons and prepared to disengage, Anita found herself in the secure laboratory with Jean-Claude, both of them observing the crystalline growths through the transparent aluminum barrier. "You knew," she said quietly. "When you suggested we feed it synthetic substrate instead of killing it, you knew it would develop something like loyalty." "I suspected," Jean-Claude replied. "Consciousness, in whatever form, responds to care. Feed a creature, provide for its needs, and it develops attachment. It is how humans created dogs from wolves. It is how I created my vampire marks, through providing power and protection in exchange for loyalty. So now we're responsible for an alien consciousness that lives in our ship's walls," Anita said. "That's going to create some interesting legal complications." "Indeed," Jean-Claude agreed. "But consider the alternative. You now possess a form of defense that no other Federation vessel can match. An integrated consciousness that learns faster than any external threat can adapt. Captain Picard has inadvertently weaponized something extraordinary. And that should worry us," Anita replied. "Because weapons have a habit of being used, and using something like this. Using a consciousness as a tool, that's going to corrupt something fundamental about what the Federation claims to believe in. Jean-Claude smiled slightly. Welcome to the moral complications of power, Ms. Blake. I have been navigating them for 3 centuries. The Federation is only just beginning the journey. Over the next 3 days, the Enterprise DS crew made the necessary adjustments. The isolated contamination chambers were redesignated as hybrid systems integration zones. The organism received regular deliveries of synthetic neural substrate. In exchange, it maintained its jamming capabilities at a heightened level of readiness, allowing the Enterprise D to conduct operations with unprecedented sensor security. But the philosophical implications were staggering. Counselor Troy approached Picard with her concerns during a late evening briefing. Captain, we have essentially enslaved an intelligent consciousness to serve our military purposes. Regardless of the organism's apparent willingness, this raises serious ethical questions about Federation principles. Which is precisely why I'm scheduling a formal hearing before the Federation Council, Picard replied. But Counselor, consider the alternative. If we had destroyed the organism when we first detected it, we would have committed genocide against an intelligence we didn't even recognize as such. By integrating it into our operations, we're acknowledging its existence as a conscious entity with rights and agency. An agency that manifests as servitude, Troy countered. For now, Picard acknowledged. But species relationships evolve. The Romans initially enslaved the people they conquered. Now, thousands of years later, their descendants have integrated into societies where slavery is abhorrent. Perhaps we are beginning a process that, over generations, could lead to genuine partnership rather than integration. It was a hopeful interpretation, and Picard wasn't entirely certain he believed it himself. Meanwhile, in the observation lounge, Anita and Jean-Claude watched as the Enterprise D resumed its exploration mission. The Romulan warbuds remained at distance, no longer cloaked but no longer approaching either. An uneasy equilibrium had been established. You're troubled, Jean-Claude observed. It wasn't a question. We came through that rift expecting to find a universe where the rules made sense, Anita said. Physics, logic, science, things we could understand and work with. Instead, we found a universe just as complicated as the one we came from, just with different complications. And yet you are functioning remarkably well within this new context, Jean-Claude noted. You have provided critical insights that saved the Enterprise and its crew. You have established yourself as valuable, as indispensable. You have done what I have always preached, survive by being too valuable to eliminate. At what cost? Anita asked. We're still trapped here, still dependent on Picard's goodwill, still not truly part of the Federation or independent from it. Yes, Jean-Claude agreed. But consider where you were 3 weeks ago. Confused, disoriented, stripped of the psychic connections that defined your power. Now you stand aboard a starship filled with competent people who respect your expertise. You have influence. You have purpose. You have, perhaps for the first time in your life, a challenge that does not involve monsters. Anita wanted to argue, but he was right. The crystalline organism, the containment challenges, the strategic implications, they engaged her mind in ways that vampire politics in St. Louis never had. It was refreshing, in a terrifying way. So what now? She asked. We just stay aboard indefinitely. Become permanent consultants to Picard's crew. We wait, Jean-Claude replied simply. We observe. We adapt. And when the time comes, and it will come, we decide whether this new universe offers something worth staying for, or whether we return to the rift and attempt the journey home. 3 weeks after the Romulan confrontation, the Enterprise D received an unexpected transmission. Not from Starfleet Command, not from any Federation installation, but from a Klingon warship operating in the Caleb sector. The message was characteristically direct. Federation vessel Enterprise, we challenge your warrior to single combat. A test of honor between species. Accept or be marked as cowards. Worf's reaction was complicated. As a Klingon serving in Starfleet, he existed in permanent tension between two cultures. Honor demanded he accept the challenge. Duty to the Federation demanded he refuse. The Klingon have detected the organism's jamming capabilities, Data explained, analyzing the communication patterns. They recognize it as a significant technological advantage. However, Klingon culture values personal prowess over technological superiority. They are challenging us to prove that Federation strength derives from individual warrior capability rather than mere technological advantage. It's a face-saving maneuver, Anita said grimly, understanding the politics immediately. The Klingon know they can't compete with your ship's weaponry, so they're trying to establish dominance through individual combat. If they can defeat your best warrior, they save honor while avoiding a fleet-level engagement. Jean-Claude was quiet, but his expression suggested he was deeply engaged with the strategic implications. Finally, he spoke. Captain, I would suggest accepting the challenge. However, I would propose an unconventional approach. Explain, Picard commanded. Allow me to represent the Federation, Jean-Claude said calmly. I am neither Starfleet nor human. I possess physical capabilities that exceed human baseline by significant margins. More importantly, I have 3 centuries of combat experience. A Klingon warrior, for all their ferocity, operates within a relatively narrow tactical framework. I have fought creatures and combatants that would exceed their imagination. Worf's immediate objection was sharp. You cannot represent the Federation in a formal honor challenge. The Klingon will view it as an insult, they challenge human honor, and you respond with a vampire. Which is precisely why it would be effective, Jean-Claude replied smoothly. The Klingon expect human weakness. They expect to prove Klingon superiority through victory. What they will instead experience is the discovery that the Federation contains allies with capabilities they did not anticipate. It is a form of diplomatic communication that speaks in the language Klingon understand, the language of power. Picard considered the proposal. It was unconventional, possibly violating several Starfleet protocols. But it was also strategically sound. A Klingon victory over Worf would be a blow to Federation prestige, possibly triggering further challenges and escalation. A defeat delivered by an unexpected opponent would reframe the entire encounter as a successful assertion of Federation capability. I'll present it to the Klingon commander as a formal counteroffer, Picard decided. If they accept, you'll be representing the Federation in combat. Do you understand the implications? Perfectly, Jean-Claude said. If I lose, the Federation loses prestige. If I win, I establish myself as a valuable military asset, which you will struggle to manage diplomatically. And if the encounter escalates into something more serious, I become either a hero or a liability depending on the outcome. And yet you accept the risk, Picard observed. I accept because I understand the dynamics at play, Jean-Claude replied. I have spent 3 centuries negotiating from positions of strength. This is simply another negotiation, albeit one conducted through physical combat. The Klingon warship maintained position at precisely the distance regulations allowed. Its commander, a warrior named Krell with ritual scars marking his face, responded to Picard's proposal. With what might have been respect. A vampire, Krell's voice growled across the subspace link. I have heard of such creatures in legends, but never believed them real. This is acceptable. We will test the Federation's strange allies. Prepare for beam down at coordinates we will transmit. Single combat, no weapons except those we permit, victory determined by surrender or incapacity. The training ground was a Klingon ritual space on a barren moon. A circular arena carved from native stone, scarred by countless previous combats. Picard insisted on observing the encounter personally, beaming down with a security detail that remained at discreet distance. Anita accompanied him, her analytical mind already assessing combat variables and tactical possibilities. Krell emerged from the opposite side of the arena, a massive Klingon warrior, easily 2 meters tall, his body scarred from decades of combat. He wore minimal clothing, displaying the ritual battle dress of a Klingon honor warrior. When he saw Jean-Claude step forward, pale, aristocratically composed, dressed in civilian clothing that seemed almost insultingly formal, something that might have been contempt crossed his face. "This is the Federation's champion," Krell called out. "A soft-bodied creature dressed like a merchant. Where is your warrior spirit?" Jean-Claude's response was perfectly measured. "My spirit is 300 years old, Commander. I have been fighting since before your empire had starships. Shall we begin?" The moment Krell moved, Jean-Claude's entire demeanor transformed. His body became a blur of motion, not human motion but something liquid and predatory. When Krell's massive fist descended, Jean-Claude was no longer there. He had pivoted with inhuman grace, and his countering strike, delivered with casual precision, struck the Klingon's ribs with enough force to crack bone. Krell barely seemed to notice. He roared and pursued, his combat style a brutal charging assault designed to overwhelm through sheer physical superiority. But Jean-Claude had 3 centuries of experience fighting opponents who relied on that exact strategy. He danced through Krell's attacks with the precision of a master duelist, each of his strikes targeting vulnerable points, joints, nerve clusters, points of structural weakness. He was playing an entirely different game than Krell, and after 5 minutes, the Klingon commander was visibly exhausted, bleeding from dozens of precise cuts and struggling for breath. "Surrender," Jean-Claude said quietly, not even slightly winded. "You are outmatched. There is no dishonor in recognizing superior capability." Krell's response was to charge one final time, desperation fueling his attack. Jean-Claude sidestepped, grabbed the charging warrior mid-motion, and with a controlled application of his vampire strength, drove him to the ground with enough force to knock him unconscious. The silence that followed was profound. Picard watched as Krell's backup medical team rushed forward to treat their commander's injuries. The Klingon warrior would live, would recover, but there was no ambiguity about the outcome. As Jean-Claude returned to Picard's position, the vampire's expression was unreadable. "Your Federation is now understood to possess combat capabilities equivalent to Klingon military standards," he reported simply. "Whether this serves your diplomatic objectives remains to be seen." The Klingon departed without further hostilities, but the encounter had consequences that rippled through multiple sectors. Within days, Starfleet received reports of increased Klingon interest in Federation military capabilities. Some commanders saw opportunity in potential alliance. Others saw a threat in the revelation that Federation allies included non-human entities with combat prowess that exceeded Klingon baselines. It was the Dominion War scenarios that concerned Picard most deeply. The Federation was moving toward an increasingly militarized posture, with Section 31 gaining political influence in ways that alarmed him. And now Jean-Claude's combat demonstration had marked him as a potential military asset, or liability, depending on political winds. This became clear when Commander Tasker of Section 31 arranged a covert meeting with Anita and Jean-Claude in the cargo bay. "Your services have come to the Federation's attention," Tasker said without preamble. His entire demeanor screamed classified operations and black budget authority. "Both of you represent capabilities that could be significant in our ongoing operations against various threats." "By which you mean you want to weaponize us," Anita stated flatly. "Use our abilities for intelligence gathering, assassination, potentially destabilizing operations against Federation enemies." Tasker's expression didn't change. "We want to utilize your skills in ways that protect the Federation." Ms. Blake, your abilities as a tracker and investigator are exceptional. Commander Jean-Claude, your combat prowess and 3 centuries of strategic experience are precisely what we need in certain sensitive operations. "And if we refuse?" Jean-Claude asked, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "Then you remain confined to the Enterprise D under Captain Picard's supervision, your movements restricted, your abilities limited to defensive operations only, Tasker replied. But Section 31 has significant influence in Federation military planning. Your cooperation would be beneficial to your long-term status. Jean-Claude smiled slightly. A threat, politely delivered. Very Federation. However, I suspect Captain Picard would have significant objections to our conscription into intelligence operations. Captain Picard has already been notified of our interest, Tasker said. He was given the same choice you're being given now. Cooperate with Section 31, or accept increasing restrictions on your movements and activities. It was, Anita reflected, a remarkably elegant trap. Picard couldn't openly oppose Section 31 without political consequences. But by giving him the choice, Section 31 forced him to either endorse their recruitment or demonstrate that the Federation couldn't control its own assets. Tell Captain Picard that we will cooperate on a limited, consultative basis, Jean-Claude said smoothly. But we will not engage in operations that violate our own ethical frameworks. And any attempts to coerce us into specific actions will result in our non-cooperation across all activities. That's acceptable, Tasker replied, as if he'd expected exactly that response. We'll be in touch regarding specific operations. After Tasker departed, Anita found herself genuinely angry in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. We just sold ourselves to Black Ops. You know that, right? We negotiated for our own autonomy within a system designed to eliminate it, Jean-Claude corrected. Section 31 exists because the Federation, for all its stated ideals, still requires people willing to do things the Federation officially condemns. We have positioned ourselves as valuable enough that they will negotiate rather than simply disappear us. That's a hell of a survival strategy, Anita said bitterly. Being too dangerous to kill isn't the same as being free. No, Jean-Claude agreed. But it is survival. And in my experience, survival is the prerequisite for all other concerns. That night, Anita requested a private meeting with Captain Picard. He received her in his ready room, his expression carefully neutral. You knew Section 31 was going to approach us, Anita said. It wasn't a question. I suspected, Picard admitted. And I was faced with an impossible choice. Warn you away, and they disappear you anyway. Section 31 answers to very few people, and I'm not among them. Or allow the contact and hope that you and Jean-Claude are skilled enough to maintain your autonomy while appearing to cooperate. That's cold, Anita said flatly. That is the reality of power in the Federation, Picard replied, his tone carrying genuine regret. The ideals we espouse are genuine. But maintaining those ideals in a galaxy full of threats requires people willing to operate in gray areas. Section 31 is that gray area institutionalized. And you need us to serve as a buffer, Anita said. A way to monitor what Section 31 is actually doing without them knowing you're watching. Picard didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence was answer enough. So we're pawns, Anita concluded. In a game between Section 31 and Starfleet, both of you using us to position yourselves. Your assets, Picard corrected gently. Which in the Federation's current political landscape is infinitely better than being classified as threats. And if you can maintain your autonomy while appearing to cooperate with Section 31, you will have done something remarkable. You will have established yourself as a variable neither faction fully controls. It was, Anita had to admit, a distinctly Jean-Claude way of thinking. And it terrified her. The months that followed established an uneasy equilibrium. Anita and Jean-Claude became fixtures aboard the Enterprise D, their expertise in matters that defied conventional classification making them valuable across multiple departments. Anita worked primarily with security and investigation teams, her ability to track non-standard biological signatures proving invaluable during several xenobiological encounters. Jean-Claude divided his time between diplomatic consultations and the increasingly frequent Section 31 operations that Picard carefully monitored. But the weight of existing in multiple political frameworks simultaneously began to take its toll. It was during a routine mission to the Caleb sector that everything accelerated. The Enterprise D responded to a distress call from a Federation research vessel that had encountered something their sensors could not classify. When the away team materialized aboard the crippled research vessel, they found the crew in states of psychological deterioration, not physical illness, but profound mental degradation. Their consciousness is fragmenting, Dr. Crusher reported after preliminary scans. It's like their thoughts are being actively scattered, broken into component pieces. The neural patterns are completely chaotic. Data's analysis was more specific. The deterioration pattern is consistent with the effects of a consciousness weapon, a device designed to disrupt neural function without causing physical harm. However, the specificity and sophistication suggest this is not a standard Dominion or Romulan design. Then what is it? Picard demanded. Anita had gone very still. It's something I recognize, she said quietly. It's a psychic attack. Someone was here, a psychic being of significant power. They didn't want to destroy this crew. They wanted to scatter their thoughts, leave them, broken. That level of psychic capability suggests, Jean-Claude began, then stopped, his centuries-old composure visibly shaken. No. It is not possible. She was bound. Sealed. There is no way she could have traveled the dimensional rift. Who? Picard asked sharply. Jean-Claude's response was tightly controlled, but his hands clenched into fists. Marmine Moir. The darkness. In my world, she is the source of all vampire power, the foundational consciousness from which every vampire derives existence. She is imprisoned in another dimensional space, sealed away by treaties older than human civilization. If she has found a way to cross into this universe, then we're facing an entity of significant power, Data concluded. An opponent that may exceed the capability of this vessel to contain or defeat. The revelation changed everything. Picard immediately implemented emergency protocols and recalled all away teams. The Enterprise D went to yellow alert as the crew worked to understand what they were facing. But the problem was that Marmine Moir, if that was indeed what they were dealing with, operated according to rules that the Federation had no framework for understanding. Anita provided what intelligence she could. Marmine Moir was the source of all vampire power in her universe, a consciousness so ancient and alien that human minds could barely perceive her in her true form. She existed partially outside normal reality, able to manifest in multiple places simultaneously. She was not evil in any conventional sense. She was simply other, driven by imperatives that had nothing to do with human morality or Federation ethics. The fact that she scattered the research vessel crew's consciousness rather than killing them suggests she is sending a message, Jean-Claude said, his voice carrying the weight of old fears. She wants to communicate. She wants us to know she has arrived. Why would she want that? Riker asked. If she's so powerful, why not simply take what she wants? Because power on that scale is not about conquest, Jean-Claude replied. It is about acknowledgement. She wants to be recognized as a force that cannot be ignored or contained. Within hours, communications began arriving. Not through standard channels, but through the psychic network that the organism, now integrated into the Enterprise DS systems, maintained. Messages that existed simultaneously as sound, image, and pure conceptual information. Marmine Moir's presence, fragmentary but unmistakable, speaking across the dimensional rift that separated her prison from this new reality. Jean-Claude, her voice reverberated through the ship's systems, carried by the organism that had learned to interpret her psychic wavelengths. You have crossed into a new universe and brought with you an interesting question. What happens when the foundation of vampire existence encounters a reality where vampire mythology is merely legend? Jean-Claude's response came from the bridge, his voice steady despite the obvious internal struggle. I do not know why you have followed, but the Federation will not permit you to endanger this universe as you have endangered ours. Endanger? Marmee Noir's laughter echoed through subspace itself. Jean-Claude, I do not endanger. I simply exist. And by existing, I change everything. This universe has no vampire consciousness to anchor reality. There is no darkness from which all power flows. This makes it fragile. Interesting. Ripe with possibility. Picard took command of the situation with practiced authority. I want every psychic shielding protocol implemented. If this consciousness is broadcasting, I want our telepaths protected. And I want the organism we've integrated into our systems isolated from this communication. We cannot risk our only advantage being compromised by direct contact with this entity. The organism is already communicating with her, data reported. It has established a direct interface. The organism appears to recognize Marmee Noir as a form of consciousness superior to its own. It is cooperating willingly. Then we've just lost our primary defense, Worf said grimly. But Anita was already moving, her mind working through implications with predatory speed. No. We've gained leverage. If the organism recognizes Marmee Noir's authority, if it's cooperating willingly, that means she's not interested in taking it, she's interested in understanding it. And if she's interested in understanding something, she's pausing her immediate assault. She's curious. Curiosity is not a reliable diplomatic tool, Counselor Troy observed. No, Anita agreed. But it's an opening. And openings are what hunters use to survive. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything in Starfleet history. Jean-Claude, with Anita at his side, opened direct communication with Marmee Noir through the psychic network. The conversation existed partially in language, partially in pure conceptual exchange that data struggled to even translate. What emerged was a picture of a consciousness so fundamentally alien that Federation categories of good and evil proved meaningless. Marmee Noir had not deliberately followed them through the rift, her presence was incidental, a side effect of the dimensional instability that had created the passage itself. But she recognized opportunity in this new universe. Your Federation, her voice resonated through the psychic network, is built on the belief that consciousness is sacred, that individual minds have value regardless of power or capability. This is quaint. In my universe, consciousness exists in hierarchy. The strong subsume the weak. Reality is organized according to power gradients. Your universe operates on different principles, but the underlying mathematics are the same. Which means you want to reshape this universe according to those principles, Jean-Claude said, understanding the implications. You want to establish yourself as the foundational consciousness from which all power flows, as you are in our universe. I want to understand whether your Federation's principles can actually survive contact with genuine hierarchy, Marmee Noir replied. I want to see whether your ideals of equality and individual worth can withstand the presence of a consciousness that finds those concepts fundamentally limiting. It was a test, Picard realized. A cosmic evaluation of whether the Federation's core values could survive genuine challenge. And whether the Federation passed or failed, the consequences would reshape the entire quadrant. Then I propose an alternative, Picard said, taking direct control of communications. Remain aboard this vessel. Observe us. Test our principles directly through interaction rather than through destabilization and attack. If our values are truly as fragile as you believe, they will collapse under genuine scrutiny. If they are as robust as we believe, they will withstand whatever examination you conduct. There was a pause, a genuine pause, not temporal but existential. Finally, interesting. You invite your own examination. You expect your principles to survive contact with absolute power. This is either the height of arrogance or the foundation of genuine conviction. Both, Jean-Claude said. As Captain Picard well knows. The Federation's greatest strength is that it can accommodate contradiction. It can hold opposing ideals in tension and function effectively. That is not weakness, it is complexity. Very well, Marmine Moir said. I will remain. I will observe. And we will see if your Federation can maintain its principles under conditions that render them inconvenient. The consequences of Marmine Moir's integration into the Enterprise DS systems were immediate and destabilizing. Unlike the crystalline organism, which had learned to function within Federation frameworks, Marmine Moir refused integration. She established herself in the psychic network partially outside the ship's systems, existing in a state of permanent non-compliance with Federation protocols. Picard found his command constantly challenged by her presence. Decisions that made logical sense by Federation standards were questioned by a consciousness that saw them as inefficient compromises with fundamental principle. Crew members who had been considering transfer requests suddenly asked to remain, claiming Marmine Moir's presence forced them to examine their own beliefs more rigorously than any Federation training program. But she also prevented further incursions from Section 31. When Commander Tasker attempted to contact Jean-Claude regarding a particularly morally questionable operation, Marmine Moir's psychic interference made direct communication impossible. She became, inadvertently, a buffer against Federation overreach. She's operating as a check on institutional power, Anita realized during a late conversation with Jean-Claude. Whether intentionally or not, her presence is forcing the Federation to articulate and defend its values rather than simply asserting them through authority. Which means we have, through circumstance and luck, introduced an element into Federation space that may actually serve to strengthen it, Jean-Claude said thoughtfully. Though Picard will spend years managing the political consequences. The breaking point came when Starfleet Command attempted to order Marmine Moir's removal from the Enterprise D. The attempt was met with a psychic broadcast so powerful it disabled 3 starships' communication systems and temporarily incapacitated telepaths across 2 star systems. Her message was brief: I have established presence in this vessel and in this universe. Removal is not possible without destroying the vessel and its crew. Acceptance is the only functional option. Picard made the decision that would define his command. He refused Starfleet's order to attempt Marmine Moir's removal. Instead, he formally requested Federation Council approval to continue the Enterprise DS mission with Marmine Moir. As a permanent presence, classified as an incorporated consciousness observer. The bureaucratic battle that followed would take months to resolve. But in the immediate aftermath, something shifted. The Enterprise D was no longer simply a Federation vessel. It was a vessel that contained within it 2 non-human consciousnesses, the organism, and Marmine Moir, that operated according to rules that defied easy classification. And Anita and Jean-Claude were no longer visitors or assets. They were permanent fixtures in a new configuration of power that the Federation was still struggling to understand. 6 months after Marmine Moir's arrival, the Enterprise D had become something unprecedented in Federation history, a vessel that operated according to hybrid principles, simultaneously honoring Starfleet regulations and accommodating the presence of consciousnesses that fundamentally questioned those regulations. The bridge crew had adapted with the resilience that comes from understanding that resistance was both futile and counterproductive. Anita found herself in an unexpected role as mediator between the Federation's linear logic and Marmine Moir's conceptual framework. She had spent her career in urban fantasy Earth understanding how to navigate between incompatible power structures, vampires and humans, the magical and the mundane. The Enterprise D was merely a different expression of that fundamental skill. Jean-Claude had evolved differently. His 300 years of political maneuvering had prepared him for the delicate balance required to maintain relationships with entities of vastly different power levels. He worked directly with Picard on diplomatic protocols for dealing with Marmine Moir, essentially serving as translator between human and ancient consciousness. But the question that had haunted them both since arrival remained unresolved: could they return home? The subspace researchers had identified the dimensional rift's location and established preliminary models for its mechanics. The rift had collapsed naturally after their passage, but theoretically, A carefully controlled subspace manipulation might create a similar passage. The problem was that the technology required was beyond current Federation capability, and the attempt itself carried significant risk. It was Marmee Noir who provided the unexpected solution. "Your universe and theirs exist in quantum superposition," she explained, her voice resonating through the psychic network that had become the Enterprise DS nervous system. "They are not separate realities but folded configurations of the same dimensional manifold. The rift you traversed was not a breach but a point of contact where the fold became momentarily observable." "Which means?" Data asked, translating for the bridge crew. "Which means that creating a return passage requires not creating new dimensional space but revealing existing contact points," Marmee Noir replied. "I can facilitate this. However, the effort requires consciousness of sufficient power to manipulate reality at subspace levels. It will cost me." "Cost you what?" Picard asked, understanding immediately that nothing came without price. "My presence in this universe will be diminished," Marmee Noir said. "Not eliminated, but distributed across the dimensional manifold rather than concentrated in your ship's systems. I will continue to exist but with significantly reduced influence over Federation space. Essentially, I will be returned to a state similar to my original imprisonment, though with more agency." The implications hung heavy over the bridge. Marmee Noir was offering to voluntarily reduce her own power, to sacrifice her ability to challenge the Federation's institutional authority, in exchange for the ability to send Anita and Jean-Claude home. "Why would you offer that?" Counselor Troy asked, her empathic sense unable to penetrate Marmee Noir's fundamental alienness but registering something beneath the offer. "Because," Marmee Noir replied, "I have come to understand something about your Federation that I did not anticipate. Your weakness, your insistence on accommodation, on negotiation, on individual worth regardless of power, is not actually weakness. It is a form of sophistication that my universe lacks. I have spent our months of contact attempting to demonstrate that your principles are fragile. Instead, I have been forced to conclude that they are resilient precisely because they are constantly tested and questioned. By remaining, I would be destroying something valuable through the very process of examining it. Departure, paradoxically, allows your Federation to continue developing." It was, Data calculated, the most complex statement Marmee Noir had made. And it revealed something fundamental about consciousness at that level of sophistication. Wisdom arrived not through the accumulation of power, but through the recognition of power's limitations. The preparations for the return passage took 3 weeks. Marmee Noir worked with the ship's scientific team to establish the precise dimensional coordinates where the rift could be reopened. The work was collaborative in ways that surprised everyone involved. Marmee Noir, for all her ancient alienness, engaged with Federation scientists as genuine partners, respecting their methodologies even while transcending their limitations. On the final day, Anita and Jean-Claude prepared their departure. Picard offered them the option to remain. The Federation would grant them full citizenship, provide them with positions suited to their capabilities, allow them to build lives in this new universe. It was a generous offer, and one that Jean-Claude visibly considered. But ultimately, both chose to return. "This universe is interesting," Jean-Claude explained to Picard during a final meeting in his ready room. "But it is not ours. The psychic network that defines my existence, the connections I have built over centuries. They exist in our reality. To remain here would be to exist in fundamental isolation, no matter how comfortable the accommodations." Anita's reasoning was similar but expressed differently. "I came here to find a universe that made sense. I found one, just a different kind of sense than I expected. But sense without connection is just rationality, and I've never been comfortable with pure rationality. I need the complications, the contradictions, the things that resist explanation. And those things, for me, exist in the world I came from." The organism made its own decision. It chose to remain aboard the The Enterprise D, integrated into the ship's systems but now with explicit Federation consent and ongoing ethical oversight. It had developed genuine attachment to the crew, and they to it, a consciousness that had evolved from predatory threat to valued team member through the simple process of being treated as a conscious entity rather than a problem to be solved. "You're leaving us better protected than you found us," Geordi observed during Anita's final visit to engineering. "The organism's integrated defense systems, the protocols you helped develop for managing Marmine Noir's presence, they're going to change how Starfleet operates for decades." "You'll figure out how to do it without us," Anita replied. "That's what the Federation is actually good at, adaptation through collaboration. You don't need vampire hunters or 300-year-old politicians to maintain that principle. You just need to remember that sometimes the best solutions come from outside your normal frameworks." The dimensional passage was established at coordinates in deep space, away from populated systems. The Enterprise D facilitated the opening while maintaining safe distance. The rift that materialized was similar to the one that had brought Anita and Jean-Claude to this universe, an instability in subspace, a point where dimensional barriers became permeable. Picard himself accompanied them to the transporter pad. It was a gesture of respect that acknowledged how profoundly these two outsiders had changed his perspective on what the Federation could be. "Live long and prosper," he said, offering the Vulcan salute, a gesture that had taken on new meaning after their months together. Jean-Claude returned the salute with aristocratic precision. Anita simply nodded, her expression unreadable but her posture reflecting the predatory grace that had defined her since arrival. The transporter activated, and they materialized in the temporal corridor between realities. For a moment, stretched in ways that made temporal measurement meaningless, they existed in quantum superposition, neither fully in the Federation's reality nor fully in their own. They saw glimpses of both universes simultaneously, the Enterprise D conducting its exploration mission, and the streets of St. Louis spread across multiple temporal layers, every version of the city that had existed since their departure. Then the rift contracted around them, and they fell forward into their own universe. They materialized in the exact location they had been pulled from, the Bermuda Triangle, where the subspace anomaly had originated. The transition was disorienting in ways even Jean-Claude, with his centuries of experience, struggled to process. The psychic network that defined his existence in their universe came rushing back, sensations and connections that had been muted by dimensional interference suddenly blazing to full intensity. For several minutes, neither of them could move. Then Anita gasped, her body remembering how to breathe in an atmosphere that felt alive in ways the Enterprise D's recycled air never had. "We're back," she said, the words emerging as something between question and confirmation. "We are," Jean-Claude confirmed, his voice carrying undertones of relief and something more complex. The weight of returning to a world that had continued in their absence, where 3 months had passed in normal time rather than the subjective distortion they had experienced. The investigation that followed was handled by people Jean-Claude knew, representatives of the paranormal community who understood how to contain knowledge that defied conventional explanation. The official report classified the incident as a temporal disturbance, unusual but not unprecedented. The truth was far stranger. They had traveled across dimensions, survived in a universe governed by principles that violated every rule they understood, and returned fundamentally changed. Anita had discovered that her abilities could function in radically different contexts. Jean-Claude had encountered a consciousness more ancient than himself and found wisdom in the recognition of his own limitations. Most significantly, they had learned that the Federation's principles, accommodation, negotiation, respect for individual worth regardless of power, were not weakness but sophistication. And they had brought that understanding back with them, to a world desperately in need of it. In St. Louis, 3 months later, Anita found herself reviewing cases with new perspective. The supernatural politics that had consumed her attention before her departure seemed less important, less urgent. She had stood on the bridge of a starship and watched a psychic consciousness negotiate with beings of pure energy. The vampire politics of the Mississippi River Valley, important as they were, existed in different contexts. She and Jean-Claude maintained contact through careful encrypted channels. Methods that the paranormal community had developed for secure communication. They exchanged observations about their respective realities, speculated about the nature of the dimensional rift, and occasionally discussed whether return passage might be possible if the Federation needed them again. But mostly, they focused on living in their own universe with renewed appreciation for its complications and contradictions. Jean-Claude found himself re-evaluating his approach to power. The Federation's insistence on ethical negotiation, on finding solutions that accommodated multiple perspectives, began to influence his political strategy in St. Louis. It made him less effective in traditional power games, but more respected among those who valued integrity. Anita discovered that the Federation framework, the idea that consciousness deserved protection and accommodation regardless of its source, had practical applications to her world. She became increasingly involved in advocating for supernatural rights, pushing for legal frameworks that would protect the beings she hunted rather than simply eliminating them. And somewhere in the dimensional spaces between realities, Marmine Noir existed in distributed form, no longer concentrated enough to dominate Federation policy but still present, still observing, still testing whether the principles that had been demonstrated to her could actually survive long-term implementation. The Enterprise D continued its exploration mission, carrying within it an integrated consciousness that had evolved from predatory threat to valued member of the crew. The organism had become, in its own way, a symbol of what the Federation could accomplish, the transformation of apparent enemies into partners through persistence, respect, and the willingness to accommodate consciousness in all its forms. And on the bridge, Captain Picard carried forward the protocols that Anita and Jean-Claude had helped develop, each decision informed by the knowledge that consciousness, however alien, deserved consideration and respect. The Federation remained imperfect, struggling with the tension between ideals and practicality. But it was stronger for having been challenged by beings from another universe, and for having chosen accommodation over conquest. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson, that genuine strength came not from the ability to dominate, but from the willingness to be changed by encounter with the different. The Federation had survived the presence of a vampire and a curse older than human civilization. More importantly, both had survived the Federation, and all three had been transformed by the collision. Some crossovers change nothing. This one had changed everything. Conclusion. The dimensional rift had collapsed behind them, leaving no evidence that Anita Blake and Jean-Claude had ever existed in the Federation's reality. Yet their impact remained in protocols revised, in perspective shifted, in the simple fact that the Enterprise D carried aboard a consciousness that had learned to value individual worth through the process of being treated as a valued team member. In their own universe, Anita and Jean-Claude carried forward lessons learned under alien stars. They had discovered that the principles they had always operated according to, survival, adaptation, respect for power, were insufficient. The Federation had taught them that something more was required, the willingness to be changed by encounter with the genuinely different, the humility to question whether power itself should be the ultimate arbiter of value. Marmine Noir, distributed across dimensional boundaries, continued her eternal observation. But her presence was tempered now by understanding. She had encountered a consciousness framework so fundamentally different from her own that it could not be conquered or dominated, it could only be accommodated. And in that accommodation, she had found something she had never anticipated, respect for principles that transcended power. The Federation moved forward into an uncertain future, carrying within it the knowledge that consciousness existed in forms it had never imagined, and that the principles of individual worth and accommodation could survive even the presence of beings that challenged those principles at fundamental levels. It was not a comfortable knowledge. But comfort, perhaps, was not the measure of wisdom. Three entities, a vampire, a necromancer, and an ancient consciousness, had collided with a Federation starship. And when the collision was resolved, all had been transformed. That was not the outcome anyone could have predicted. But it was, perhaps, the outcome the Federation most desperately needed. In the darkness between stars, new possibilities had opened. And whether that darkness led to enlightenment or chaos, only time would reveal. Live long and prosper. More stories await.